Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Game video we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to start things out with the AMD Ryzen 3700U. Specifically, there have been two leaked benchmarks which reveal several details of this upcoming processor, but also a number of mysteries alongside it. So, the Ryzen 7 3700U is being listed in the various benchmarks as a 4-core 8-thread part. The base clock is showing to be 2.2 GHz with a boost clock of 3.8 GHz, and that isn't any different actually than the Ryzen 7 2700U. Although we do have to take into consideration that it is once again an engineering sample. Furthermore, from the wording and from the code name of the processor, it appears to be a 10 to 25 watt part. The nominal TDP for the 2700U, just for your FYI, was around 15 watts, although it was configurable for different laptop SKUs, obviously depending on what the vendor was going for in terms of power consumption. Now, things get more confusing with the GPU, because user benchmark are reporting this GPU to be Picasso, which we've heard a significant amount about, although we know very little about it. However, sisoft Sandra actually reports it to be Vega 10, which brings us to a couple of questions. One, is it possible that sisoft Sandra is just like, I don't know what's going on, help me, I'm confused? That's always a good possibility. The second option is that Picasso is essentially Vega 10, the mobile variant, just to clarify here, but with a rebrand or a refresh or a derivative thereof. For example, and this is a pure speculation, it could be a 7nm refresh, a 12nm refresh. It could be just a higher clock speed variant. It could be very similar but with different number of compute units or what have you. Back when Ryzen first launched in April 2017, Bristol Ridge was the APU series that AMD offered. So basically there was a massive discrepancy because you had Zen, which was obviously the far superior architecture to Bristol Ridge, but even so, AMD branded them and it was a whole thing. So there are some questions. What CPU is found here? As I mentioned, the 4-core 8 threads and clock speeds are very reminiscent, and by reminiscent they're pretty much identical to the 2700U. So is it a Zen? Is it a Zen Plus architecture? Or is it Zen 2 and AMD at the moment are just being coy with the clock speeds? It's unlikely that they've got additional cores, although it's possible maybe this is a lower end SKU that has been tested here. Who really knows 100%? It's going to be interesting though, because if it's just a refresh, it means AMD haven't really done that much, and it does bring into question what we're going to see for the remaining desktop SKUs. There was actually a series of slides which leaked from Informatica Cielo, and they did demonstrate that it's most likely going to be a Zen 2 based processor. So it's very probable, if that's the case, that AMD are just not running the processor at the maximum clock speeds right now. In other words, they're simply working on engineering sample quality silicon, and we will see the base clock go to like 2.5 or 2.6 gigahertz, and maybe the turbo frequency go up to like 4.2, 4.3. That's not a rumor going around, I'm simply speculating here. So that's definitely one way to go. The other thing I'd like to discuss is the 29% IPC gains that AMD told us about after the Next Horizon event. So this information came from various slides. They also released it as a press statement. It was to investors as well. They weren't shy about it, but they prefaced it. They said specifically that it is with certain loads. It is with loads which have high floating point performance as well as integer performance. We think it's going to be around the 29%. We did caution that this was most likely the case. After all, different applications put different loads on different parts of the processor. Some applications might put higher loads on the floating point units or integer units, or really hammer the level 2 cache or level 1 cache, or it's possible that it could just be unoptimized code and isn't necessarily the greatest for Zen's branch prediction, and so on. I'm just throwing out examples. So IPC gains are really difficult to measure because they do very much depend upon the application. AMD released a statement. I'm going to read it out to you. The data in the footnote represented the performance improvement in micro benchmark for a specific financial service workload, which benefits from both integer and floating point performance improvement. It is not intended to quantify the IPC increase a user should expect across a wide range of applications. We will provide additional details on Zen 2 IPC improvements and, more importantly, how the combination of a next-generation architecture and advanced 7nm process technology delivers more performance per socket when the product launches. Notice AMD are also specifying per socket. So this is still mostly pertaining to Rome, which of course is the second generation of EPYC. There is no mention here of the desktop derivatives of the processor. So what clock speeds, what IPC gains we're going to see, and so on remains a question. We don't even know the core count for the mainstream processors. I still don't believe it's going to be 8 cores. I believe it's going to be more, but once again, that's a topic for a different video. So what AMD are doing here is actually quite admirable, but also makes sense. They're grabbing the bull by the horns, and they are trying to alleviate the possibility, the real possibility of disappointment in the future, because people will, of course, crucify them if the IPC gains are more realistic, like 15 or like 13%, which I personally believe is probably going to be the number we're going to see, depending on the generation you're comparing it. Just for a moment, let's say that it's against the first generation of Zen versus Zen 2. Now, the rumours were that we're going to see between a 10 to 13, possibly 15, but most likely 13% uplift on average. So, once again, on average means a typical workload. If you take several different benchmarks, several different games, and you average the performance, roughly that's going to be it. And obviously, you're going to always get the outliers, the high performance and ones where there's very little difference at all. And that's just kind of how it always is, right? What's my takeaway? Is this bad for AMD? No. I'm not surprised. It's what we cautioned against. And honestly speaking, even if it's a 10% IPC gain, let's be ultra cautious here. So it's a 10% IPC gain. And we also see a couple of 100 megahertz, let's say 300 or 400 megahertz addition on the clock speed. I don't think anyone is going to complain. It's a greater IPC jump than what Intel have managed over the last several generations. And it really comes down to the price point as well. I mean, we've all seen the benchmarks of the 9900K when they're TDP limited. Yes, the 9900K is still faster, particularly with gaming, but it's not hugely faster. And for price-conscious people, people who really don't want to spend, that much more cash and get a reasonable 8-core processor, the 2700X is really still a good bargain. AMD don't necessarily have to outcompete Intel in every single criteria, in every single category. The bottom line is, the 1700X, if you bought it when it first launched, you're still sitting rather pretty. It is an incredibly great processor. But then for gaming, if you also own a 4770K, I know I keep using an example, but you could also go with a 2600K heavily overclocked. You're only really starting to see the processors struggle now, and that's only if you've got a really high-end card and not super pushing the resolution. Even games like Assassin's Creed, I demonstrated this, by the way, in a video. You can check it out if you want in the description. I'll try to remember to link it. Basically, the 4770K does a pretty good job when overclocked at past 4 GHz. So for games, on average, most of the work goes to the GPU, but minimum frame rates, Intel still has the advantage on like the 8700K, the 9700K, the 9900K. But as an overall workhorse, for the value, Ryzen is doing very well. So if AMD can just bump that IPC a little bit, get the game performance up a little more, be more Intel-like, maybe not quite as good as Intel, but pretty darn close, have the clock speed tweaked a little more as well, and still maintain that value, I think they're going to sell like hotcakes. Is it going to be Intel in the long term? Who knows? But once again, AMD don't need to be Intel in all areas, they just need to be competitive. And I think that, in the short term, considering they went from, not competitive at all, particularly in the server landscape, they own less than 1% of the server market, to suddenly Intel being rather concerned and to demo that Rome, a 64-core chip, outpaced 2 Xeon 8180s, admittedly in a specific benchmark. And once again, I will caution everyone, let's wait to see a wider gamut, a wider range of tests on there, to really know how Intel are going to fare. After all, they are also releasing their own new upgraded variants of Xeon as well over the next several months. So yeah, it's going to be interesting and it's going to be really cool. And the bottom line for me is that it just benefits us, right? We are consumers, we have the money, we decide what we want to spend that cash on, and it's just more choice, which is always a great thing. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. This is also an article, by the way, if you want it in article form. That's linked, of course, as well in the video description. If you have enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe if you haven't already, because it helps us out muchly. But with all of that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.